So, when you're at an investigation site, make sure you pay attention to the smallest details. You can often miss out on things right in front of you. You need to trust your gut, see what others can't. Imagine how things went. Tomorrow, you guys could have the best experience of the entire year at the investigation site. I'm going to need some extra support so you guys can be my right hand. Our professor ended his session with these words, leaving us all excited for the next day. It was my last year of postgraduate studies in journalism. I'd always been fascinated by crime scenes and haunted places. I had the urge to uncover the truth behind the unusual activities, but as my parents believe, diving directly into the ocean would only kill me. The best way is to first learn how to swim. Keeping that advice in mind, I enrolled in a reputed law school here in Columbia. Although the school was far from my home, it looked like a great opportunity to fulfill my dreams. However, my initial years were disappointing. I assumed that a major in journalism and investigation would allow me to explore murder sites, move negotiations and kidnappings, and unveil hidden truths of tyrant mafias and their businesses. Nevertheless, my hopes were all crushed during the years. Instead of exploring murder sites, I had to study and create reports about events in the 1900s. In place of holding the burden of good negotiations, I was carrying the burden of writing exams that had no practical use. In short, I'd lost all expectation of becoming an investigator through my college degrees. Nevertheless, we had one professor that appealed to me as a person I wanted to be like. Our journalism professor, Mr. Radmel, was an anchor that hosted a popular screen time show on the country's biggest television network. His show talked about various mafias and underworld activities in Colombia that had stayed away from the public eye. He's encountered several murder attempts by his enemies, but he'd been lucky each time. His courage, determination, and commitment were impressive traits that inspired our entire class. All of us wanted to have a bit of his personality in us, but he was one of a kind. Despite his common physique, he was never afraid of taking on a challenge. Once mentioned that he'd survived 10 days without food while in captivity, but his sheer courage to find a way out has helped him to thrive. I sought my guidance from him and wished to be working under him to learn his deals. Journalism class was our last for the day, but I didn't feel like going to the hostel. Although I never felt that I loved my family, my time in Colombia had been rough. There have been tiring days where I wanted my parents to be with me. Their advice that spiked my years in the past appeared as care notes. Their occasional smiles were probably the most precious thing for me at the time. With memories in my mind, I took refuge in an old case of a barber published in a newspaper, which I found in our campus's library. The case wasn't a study case that I'd been making reports on. It was a master plan executed with thorough complexity that, despite 7 years of its existence, the armed forces haven't been able to find a single loophole to trace the killer. I started analyzing the report, and a few things amazed me. It mentioned that the police station near Duck River received an unknown call on a random day. It said a blast would take place in a barber shop located at Street 17. The police started their operations and rushed to the street. They sealed 50-meter radius around the shop to avoid any collateral damage. But time passed and nothing happened. After some time, the police entered the shop to find a note on the mirror written in red ink. It said, "You won't know." Other than the note, the shop looked clean and fresh. There were no stains on the mirror. The floor was clean and everything looked okay. The police asked for the shop owner, and upon inquiry, multiple reports suggested that the shop hadn't been used for more than 7 years. The locals suggested that the shop owner was killed by a rich kid who, under the influence of drugs, used his pistol to murder him. The courts couldn't do anything in the matter, and the person had no charges against him. Later the same day, the police station got a call that the same rich kid had been killed by a bullet from his gun. Upon inspection, the police found a similar "you won't know" note on his bathroom mirror. The first thoughts go to the siblings or blood relatives of the barber, as they might try to avenge the relative's death. But investigation showed that those people haven't been in the country for years. Within the next 3 days, more than 10 murders took place, and all of them had one similarity. One mirror of the house had a note that read, "You won't know." written with red ink. The police had been researching the report for years, but they couldn't find anything. The case was a refresher dose for my mind. It blew me off, and a small portion of my mind wanted to go to Duck River Station to know more about the case. Nevertheless, it was about 8 o'clock at night, and my hostel only had free dinner till 9 p.m. So I rushed to my hostel without wasting a single second over pondering the case. Fortunately, it was a good day, and fresh meat was served with rice. The day ended on a high note, and I was expecting the next day to be even better. But what happened next would better have been a nightmare than reality.
Midnight Stories.
That night was awkward. I couldn't sleep, and it wasn't because of the excitement of the investigation tomorrow. It was more about the case I'd been thinking of lately. Although at the time of reading it, I didn't feel any fear. At bedtime, my feelings changed. I was having nightmares. The mirror of my hostel room was placed right in front of me. Every time I woke up that night, my eyes saw, "You won't know," written on it. The text would disappear as soon as I got close to it. It was probably just a hallucination just from my obsession with the case. I could barely sleep an hour, but I did sleep when I shouldn't have. It was about 5 in the morning, and my class was scheduled for 8 a.m. I thought a 2-hour sleep wouldn't do any harm. It would instead help me look fresh. The dawn had already started, so the glares of light visible through my room's window brought peace to my heart. I slept. I didn't know what kind of sleep that was. It was so serene, and I couldn't get over it. Of all the days I could have overslept, I chose a career-defining day. My eyes opened at 8:30 a.m. I didn't check my phone as I was still convinced that I had slept just fine, and there was ample time remaining. The other reason was I had to go to the bathroom. I spent another half hour taking a bath. After wasting precious time, I reached for my phone. My dreams shattered in front of my eyes. It was 8:55 a.m., and the class had already started an hour earlier. I was shocked. I swept my tongue over my lips with a grin of failure, but I still thought I might catch the bus to the investigation site. I quickly got dressed, picked my university card, and rushed to the campus to know where they were headed. At the campus, I asked the receptionist if she knew where the bus was headed. She gave me a surprising reply. "Has Mr. Radmel planned a trip this week? We have no clue about it. Generally, when we would go on an excursion, we would seek a non-objection letter from the head office. The letter was delivered to the receptionist, who will seek the desired approval and provide us the signed documents and required funds and logistics." I decided to call a friend of mine to know if he could tell me where we were going so I could catch up with them. He picked up the phone and told me they were headed to the Forest Hills through the 431 highway. It was an empty route, and few buses went that way. It led me to regret it further. How come I miss an investigation at one of the most vivifying places there could ever be? I carried on the talk and asked him what it was like and how they felt. He started describing the scenery to me. He highlighted the curved roads built on an incline and how I shouldn't have missed it. But suddenly, I heard a deafening scream in the background. It was my classmates. Their screams shocked me. And then, within a moment, I heard another noise that was as loud as a bomb blast. I was stunned for a moment. I called out my friend's name, but he didn't respond. I called on some other people on the bus. Their phones were unreachable. I rushed to call for help. I described the situation to the receptionist, who called for the emergency department and police. Fortunately, I'd asked about their route to help the police with their location. Although it was a challenging task, I convinced the emergency team to take me with them. Within about an hour, we were at the Forest Hills. The road was majestic, surrounded by greenery at the bottoms, and we were going up the mountains. Nevertheless, I wasn't interested in appreciating the magnificence of the environment. Instead, during the entire time, I called my friends, looking for a solution and something that could help. There were tons of calls to Mr. Radmel, too. but surprisingly, his phone was off. But we gave the benefit of the doubt to the chance that his phone battery might have died. It was hard to find where they were precisely during the blast. We were about to stop and look for some clues before moving ahead until we saw some people waving at our van from the other side of the hills. We rushed to the place. And that side of the road had a broken barrier, indicating that a vehicle had fallen into the forest down the hill. I didn't want to think about it. I couldn't imagine it happening. But after some inquiry, my fears turned into reality. It was the same bus. The scream of my classmates echoed in my ears. Tons of flashbacks ran past me. My eyes were full of tears. My face turned red. It wasn't a typical scream. The noise of the blast wasn't from a bomb. It was the noise of the bus trucking the forest from 100 feet up. The people standing by the roadside were locals who had tried rescuing the people. But because the forest was way too deep, sliding down from the hills to save a life would have resulted in another fatal incident. After about 10 minutes, I regained consciousness and pledged that the best way to pay back my class would be to avenge their death and get the bus contract company banned so other precious lives could be saved. I sat on a rock at the side of the road and started thinking about my next step while the rescue team analyzed the place and recovered the bodies. I heard the locals saying that they believed the driver was drunk for the way he was driving. It rang a bell in my mind. I was sure that the driver wasn't drunk, because if he were, the bus would have fallen way earlier rather than in the middle of the hills. I got up and started questioning them about the incident. I asked why they felt he was drunk. They said that the bus didn't brake for a bit of a moment, and it felt as if the driver didn't even think of braking. He came in at speed and broke the fence to fall. I had mixed thoughts in my mind, and I subconsciously started connecting the dots. How come a driver working in a contract company made such an amateur mistake? Why did the incident happen on the same day Mr. Radmill was going to uncover a crime? These weren't all coincidences. There had been something fishy going on around, and I needed to discover. Somebody had killed my entire class but me, and I wasn't going to sit silent. But before I rushed into a conclusion, I needed to be 100% sure. I looked at the road for braking marks. I was shocked to see the road didn't have a slight hint of braking. The road was as normal as it could be, and I was sure that someone had tampered with the brakes. I quickly rushed the enforcement officer to the place and described what I found. He commended my efforts, and because I was a final year student, he thought it was okay for me to go with them for further investigation. On our walk to the police car, he told me that if it was brake tampering in the hilly area, the first indication is the wear on the tires gradually decreases after each brake, as the road was less frequently used. Any old remains of rubber were already wiped off by the hilly air. We started going down the hill and tracked the rubber dispositions. The tracker was able to differentiate between the age of the rubber carbon, so we were able to sort it based on the ones that were less than a day old. To confirm our hypothesis, the rubber deposits were getting greater and greater as we went downhill. It was evident that the brake had been unchaining after each attempt, indicating that someone might have loosened the nuts, which eventually led to the brake failure. Keeping the pain of my classmates' loss aside, I was happy about my discovery. Still, the police officer broke my heart when he said I couldn't be part of any future investigation, as it might put my life at risk. I wasn't willing to give up and insisted, but he didn't look to change his decision. I hadn't always been a rebellious kid, and I knew what my next step would be. If we were assured that the brake loosened after each attempt, it might have been tampered during its last brake service. Fortunately, I was lucky to get on board to go back to the school with the police, as our campus's team was still working on the recovery. After about 10 minutes on our way back, the officer's phone rang, and then he heard something that turned him pale. He said to his subordinate he had returned. In a moment of curiosity, I waited for what he had to say next. The van had a "you won't know" written on the mirror. Another officer told me that this mirror is smooth and didn't look like a part of the van. The sentence sent shivers down my spine. I had goosebumps. My eyes popped out. I started thinking that I hadn't woken from a nightmare, but this sleep wasn't looking as vague as other sequels during the night. It was a reality that I had to confront. I asked the officer, "How do you plan to solve the case further? And what if it remains unsolvable, just like the other 10? He said that the security of those alive is more important than the dead. It was essential to ensure that every other possible victim was guarded instantly. I wanted to go to the crime scene with them, but he didn't let me. I was ordered to go back to the hostel and stay away from the case. Of course, I had no other choice but to back out, but I couldn't resist thinking about my fellows and our beautiful memories on my way back. I'd been with them for the past 4 years, and they were nothing less than family for me. I had an antsy feeling. I couldn't resist but think of avenging their death. After the inner temptation rose to its peak, I decided that avenging their death was the best I could do. I would either come out victorious or perish in the process. With the reignited passion for solving unsolvable crimes, I started to plan my strategy. I didn't have many clues, but I knew where I could find them. However, I knew that I'd face a problem during my investigation. I wasn't a real investigator. People wouldn't be interested in giving me the correct answers, or might not even answer me at all. The first issue was to look for an ID that could pass as official. My day had been spent in moments of hurry, so running was the last thing I wanted to do, but I still walked fast as I could to an internet cafe nearby. I quickly picked up a template, edited my name in, and sent it for print. The guy managing the cardboard printer was pretty rough on me. Despite being involved in tons of illegal activities, he wouldn't let me print the card because it was illegal. After consistent begging, he wasn't moved, so I had only one way. I took out my wallet, gave him a hefty note at the table, and boom! The print looked as fine as a real one. I put it on a cover and was now a detective. The next task was to go to the bus contract company and carry on with my investigation. I dressed up as a detective, wore a tie and a cool jacket. I kept a knife in my belt to come in handy if things turned bad. The bus was owned by ZHS Contracts, close to our hostel. It was about noon, and I was pretty sure that if I reached there before lunch break, I'd be there before the police, so no one would intervene in my investigation. At ZHS Contracts, I was pampered like a real detective. The boss came forward to assist me in the procedure. When I told them the reason for my arrival, he showed me condolences and assured me that he'd cooperate. He took me to the security room to show me the CCTV recordings of the last day. Another revelation led to the fact that the contract company didn't have a booking in the name for Mr. Radmill or the college. It was booked by a third party and paid for with cash, so no record was available. I looked through the activity around the bus, and it wasn't hard to detect what went wrong. I noticed a person scrolling around the bus for a long while, and when everyone went for lunch, he started taking off the bus's back wheels. I wanted to ensure, so I kept watching and realized that he was actually the reason for my friend's death. He loosened the disc pads of the car and then placed the tire back. The loose disc pads would eventually come out, but they wouldn't be noticeable for the driver or passengers. I inquired where this person was right then, and it wasn't unexpected to hear that he'd been missing from work. My detective leverage came in handy here, as the boss sent a worker with me to Eller's house. We reached his place within 10 minutes. As we knocked on the door, I asked the worker not to give a slight hint of who I was until we had covered him. Unfortunately, our plan backfired. Eller heard our conversation from the door. He tried escaping from the window, but lucky for us, his foot caught in the wooden ceiling, and he couldn't run any longer. As we got hold of him, we didn't have much to do. He was already frightened and started begging for mercy in the name of his small children. I was again amazed at how I looked like an actual detective. I even told him I'd help him get off on good conduct grounds if he'd tell me why he did it. He claimed that he'd fallen prey to greed. I asked him to take us where the main conspirator was, and that was a mistake. We walked with him. He took us to an old warehouse in a deserted area. The warehouse had trucks around it, and I could sense the problem was in front of me. I took a deep breath and looked for a back opening so that I could catch him by surprise. At that moment, I thought of calling for some help, but the greed of getting the recognition of solving an unsolvable case on my own got to my head, and I jumped in. Boom! There were more than 10 people, and none of them looked weak. As soon as they saw me, all of them rushed with their strength, and at that moment, I felt like a zebra to the lions. I ran as fast as I could, but they caught me. I tried freeing myself from their hold, but I couldn't. They tied up my feet and hands and stuffed a cloth in my mouth. After some time, I just passed out. couldn't tell you when I woke up, but I was definitely at a different place. It was an old factory. I didn't know the exact location, neither could I call for help. But this place wasn't an ordinary factory. It was the hub of human trafficking in Colombia. I could see multiple dozens of people lying unconscious in front of me. They were all tied up and about to be sent to different locations. The room was empty, and I couldn't see a goon. I tried my best to reach my pocket for the knife and cut the cloth. After a consistent and painful struggle, I succeeded. At that moment, I only cared about my life. I observed if the area was clear. I crawled to a corner to analyze the place and look for an opening to escape. It was dark. My body was dried up. I had no energy in me. I found a small gate at the other end of the room. I sensed no danger and started crawling to the door. I felt pity for the poor souls and their families lying around me, but I couldn't do anything. I wished I had a teleporter to transport them to their homes. As I tried to open the door, my hand struck the boxes at the side, and they created a loud noise. I knew hiding wouldn't do anything, so I started running with no thoughts in my mind. The next thing I remember is a strong attack on my head. I woke up at the hospital with doctors around me and police waiting for me to gain consciousness. I felt relaxed that I had survived the nightmare and was finally safe. An officer came to me and said in a warm voice, "You're probably the most idiotically brave human I have ever seen in my life." I smiled at it. My mouth had a nebulizer attached to it, so I questioned him with my eyes regarding what happened. So the backstory was that when police reached the contract company and heard about me being dressed up as a fake investigator, they thought of me as the killer. The fact that I was the only one that wasn't involved in the accident while the rest of my class was also made me look suspicious. They tracked me down to the warehouse, where they faced the same goons. As the police were a more potent force, the goons escaped in their cars to the old factory and were followed by police. After a scuffle between the two, the police were able to rescue all people from the factory. They were sent to their respective homes. I was excited that everything was finally solved except two. The police found no traces of the real mastermind. All people at the factory were mere workers that worked for a bigger aim. Mr. Radmill had been missing all the while. I eventually moved on and was returned after a week of stay. The charges of impersonating a police officer were dropped, considering I had a noble aim and I didn't misuse it. Life got back to usual without my friends until one fine night. I returned to my hostel and looked in the mirror. It had a note written in red ink that said, "You won't know."